locked into Panzer Unleashed. And tonight we're not reacting to any headlines. We're not chasing any viral clips. And we're not feeding into the outrage machine that's running 24/7. And tonight we're just stepping back and looking at something bigger, something slower, and something a lot more strategic. Because if you don't understand the environment you're operating in, you will mistake noise for threat and the emotion for strategy. And there is a quiet pressure in the air right now, a constant pull on your attention. A steady drip of tension that keeps people agitated and divided. And most don't even recognize this. It's happening because it feels normal. When chaos becomes normal, clarity feels strange, and that's dangerous as hell. So tonight, we're going to go ahead and break it down kind of calmly, intelligently, and deliberately. Because strength without discipline is noise, people. And awareness without structure is just anxiety. Let's take a breath and reset before we go any further, because signal boosting isn't about hype, it's about alignment. And if you've been feeling tired but weird, if you've been feeling like everything is like urgent all the time, that's not weakness. That's overstimulation. And your nervous system was not designed for constant alerts, endless commentary, and perpetual conflict. It was designed for bursts of stress, followed by recovery. And most people haven't truly recovered in years. That constant agitation changes the way you think, the way you speak, and the way you interpret reality. It makes you quicker to anger, slower to listen, and more likely to assume hostility where there may only be, disarrangement. And, real strength right now is not about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the most controlled. When you hear something provocative and choose not to react immediately, you win. You can sit with information before forming an opinion, and you win. And when you can disagree without losing composure, you win again. Emotional regulation is not passivity. It is discipline, under pressure. And discipline under pressure is what separates people who build from people who burn out. And if you want to stand out in this era, cultivate steadiness. You have to train your body so your stress response doesn't own you. You have to train your mind so every headline doesn't hijack you, okay? Train your speech so your words carry weight instead of hate. Calm is not surrender, people. Calm is controlled power. And so let's go ahead and move into the main op, because we need to address something most people feel but rarely articulate. Outrage has become a business model out there. And the faster you react, the more you post. And, the more you argue out there, the more valuable you are to these platforms that thrive on engagement, because the visions, that right there drives the clicks, and clicks drive the revenue. And the revenue sustains the entire structure, people. And that means emotional spikes are rewarded while nuisances is ignored. And when you open up your phone, people, and you feel that pulse rise within minutes, that's not accidental. Content is curated to hold your attention. And the strongest way to hold your attention is through emotion. And anger, it spreads faster than analysis, people. Fear spreads faster than facts. Tribal loyalty spreads faster than balance, okay? And over time, this environment conditions people to think in extremes because extremes are simpler and simplicity feels satisfying. But, reality is complex and complex problems require disciplined thinking. And if you allow yourself to be pulled into every digital battle out there, you will burn energy on arguments that basically go nowhere. It's like a dog chasing his tail. Meanwhile, these areas of your life that actually require strategy, your health, your finances, your relationships, your long-term planning, receive less attention. That trade off is subtle but significant. Exhausted people, they do not organize efficiently. Distracted people, they don't build effectively. And emotionally flooded people do not think long term whatsoever. So the question becomes, are you spending more time reacting to narratives or constructing your own stability? Because one drains you and the other strengthens. So you need to disengage from reality. You have to engage with it deliberately. Slow down your intake, people. Verify before sharing anything because misinformation is everywhere. It's like the plague. Think before amplifying. And if something is designed purely to provoke you, pause and ask whether your reaction is productive or merely, predictable. Because predictable reactions are easy to manipulate and strategic responses are not. So, anyways, let's go ahead and break it down, people. We're going to hop into a war room briefing really quick because this is where we analyze instead of react. And when a controversial event occurs, the first wave you see is not calm analysis. It's emotional framing. Headlines are crafted to trigger, and commentary is crafted to polarize. And social feeds quickly divide into camps, if you haven't noticed, people. Each camp reinforces its own little narrative while, dismissing the others as, irrational or malicious. In that escalation, something critical gets lost, depth. Complex issues are reduced to slogans, and slogans end up replaced, So with people, like I said, when they argue about identity rather than policy, about symbolism or, rather than structure, this result is sustained emotional heat, with minimal constructive output. Now, consider the long-term impact of that pattern, people. Relationships fracture, communities distrust each other, and productive collaboration becomes more difficult. Meanwhile, structural issues remain largely untouched because the energy that could have been directed towards solutions is spent on digital warfare. And this is not about denying, real problems. It's about recognizing when the presentation of those problems is engineered to inflame rather than inform. And a disciplined observer asks different questions. Who benefits from this framing? What details are missing? What incentives are at play here? Is this conversation leading to actionable change or simply reinforcing division? When you ask those questions consistently, you step out of the emotional current and onto solid ground. And that shift alone gives you leverage, people, because most people never pause long enough to analyze that pattern. So what does disciplined living look like in practice? It begins with regulating your body because chronic stress distorts perception. Prioritize your sleep, people, as if it were, strategic maintenance, because it is. Move your body consistently. Do not chase, aesthetics, but to stabilize your nervous system, bing bang, you're on the right course. So set those clear boundaries on when you consume news so your day is not, dictated by alerts. Invest in one practical skill at a time and deepen it intentionally, because competence builds confidence, and confident people are less reactive. Strengthen real world relationships, through direct conversation, because digital connection, it can't replace human trust. None of this dramatic, none of this. It all trends online, but over time, it builds a foundation that cannot be shaken by every headline. It's sustainable resilience, is built quietly through repeated discipline choices. So, you don't need to shout to be strong, okay? You need to be consistent. And the quiet war for your focus is real, but it is not unbeatable. You're not required to match chaos with chaos, okay? And you're not obligated to react on command. Guard your attention, regulate your stress, and analyze before engaging. Build before criticizing. When you become steady in a volatile environment, okay, you become difficult to manipulate and hard to destabilize. So that steadiness is rare, and rare qualities carry influence. Panzer Unleashed is not about noise for the sake of noise. It's about readiness, discipline, and the kind of strength that holds under pressure. So, my friends, stay sharp, stay measured, and remember that controlled minds shape outcomes far more effectively than reactive ones ever will. Once again, this is Scott Panzer Paulson reporting live here from Hack Studios in the dusty deserts of Tucson, Arizona. Once again, over and out.